All right, so welcome again. Thank you so much for coming to our event to introduce the special collection, Language Documentation Collections Assessment and Recognition. And first, I want to give just a little bit of a brief background on language documentation, just so that we're all on the same page, even though I assume that many of you in the audience are already somewhat familiar with language documentation as a discipline. So yes, in reaction to the rapid decline in linguistic diversity around the world, many linguists have called for an increased allocation of resources and efforts to support the documentation of endangered languages and linguistic practices. And furthermore, the active participation of speech communities in the documentation process. This is reflected in the emergence of funding programs such as the Endangered Languages Documentation Program and also the National Science Foundation Dynamic Language Infrastructure Program and the National Endowment for the Humanities Documenting Endangered Languages Fellowship. Also, there are now conferences and workshops dedicated to language documentation, including the International Conference of Language Documentation and Conservation, as well as Computel. And there are also journals, such as the Language Documentation and Description Journal, Language Documentation and Conservation, and more recently, a new section of the journal Language entitled Language Revitalization and Documentation. Language documentation represents a return to the focus on resource creation as a legitimate academic activity. Nicholas P. Himmelmann's seminal article in 1998, titled Documentary and Descriptive Linguistics, ushered in a wave of interest in producing collections of linguistic data which are open access, include audiovisual recordings in addition to text data, and are representative of the full range of linguistic variation exhibited by each speech community. Language documentation strives to work more closely with speech communities to create resources which are of use both to academic researchers as well as members of the endangered languages communities that they work with. And these communities can vary drastically in many ways, including the number of speakers, the vitality of the language, the socioeconomic status of the community, and the official status of the language. Here you see a speech community from the United States, which is well established and has a strong language conservation program in place. Other communities may have very little in the way of support and may reside in much more resource-constrained areas. Here is a young member of the Hadza community who traditionally followed a foraging lifestyle in the remote wilderness of East Africa. For practitioners of language documentation to work with communities like the Hadza, it is often necessary to spend extensive amounts of time in the community to build relationships and a shared understanding of the goals of the project. Here you can see my colleague, Andrew Harvey, standing by his tent in the village of Sungu, waiting to meet with a local Hadza community leader. Practitioners of language documentation often train members of the community to collect their own data. This not only gives communities more agency in the research program, but also results in a more comprehensive documentary record. Language documentation is also an iterative process, which can last for many years or even decades. After an initial phase during which practitioners train members of the community to collect data, there are cycles of periods of data collection, data distribution, and then feedback. And feedback or guidance can come from practitioners, members of the community, or other academic scholars who review the materials. The primary intended outcome of language documentation is the creation of a large collection of audiovisual and textual data, which is often hosted at a special repository known as a language archive. Here you can see images from the Hadza collection at the Endangered Languages Archive. The collection has a landing page, which you see on the left, and a search interface, which you see on the right. In addition to the large amount of work required to create language documentation collections, practitioners of language documentation face a number of challenges in getting recognition for their work. These include a lack of clear standards for data creation, curation, sharing, and reuse, lack of standards for the peer review of language documentation collections, and the lack of standards for the evaluation of language documentation collections by hiring committees. And that brings us to the special collection, which is the focus of our presentation today. And I'll hand it off to Hugh.
Thank you, Richard. So the collection of papers that we are putting together and editing aims to develop a detailed outline of what an effective peer-reviewed process for documentary materials might look like, and how such systems would better foster recognition for those materials in academic evaluation systems, such as hiring, promotion, and tenure. So as many of you might know, when you write a peer-reviewed article and publish it, that can help you argue or present your portfolio for hiring and tenure applications. And the tree diagram on the right kind of describes what the process is for that, and that process can change from publisher to publisher. However, the gap that we are perceiving is that there is no such process for evaluating resources that are created in a collection of language documentation materials, and there's no clear way to present that to different hiring or tenure boards and promotion boards. And those processes obviously look different at different institutions and are valued differently and impact authors and creators differently in different institutions around the world. So this is a rather large problem and has many different influential components for consideration. So we are very open to exploring those nuanced differences in our collection as people can describe their differences. So we are very open to those kinds of ideas. Now, our collection, next slide, please. Yes, so our collection has 3 types of submissions, and articles that explore the assessment criteria for a language documentation collection, articles that explore an assessment procedure. So how would we do things like peer review or quality control in a language documentation collection? And finally, we are very open to articles that present use case studies for either the development of the collection, assessment, and the assessment criteria. So the application of so if we think of the first 2 types as theory, then the third one would be the application of theory. So we're looking for both theory and application in our collection. Next slide, please. Yeah, so if we were to explore some of the subtopics that are in articles that explore assessment criteria, some of the ideas that we know that are out there that deserve to be explored a little bit more are the applications of levels of access to content. So open access, restricted access, sensitive materials, community-based access, or associated intellectual property information and reusability. A big thing to discuss or to look at is data organization, the quality of collection description, and the artifact metadata. So how well described are the collections? And this often impacts how reusable they are because it impacts how findable they are. Quantity and quality and modality of the artifacts that are preserved in institutional repositories, including the collection as a whole. So not just the individual files, but the way the collection is connected. File formats and software dependencies. Himmelmann, in his seminal article, talked about presenting a cohesive documentary record. And so how cohesive or comprehensive is the collection as it's presented? Is it a collection that is of a specific speech genre or multiple speech genres, or how is that connected or evaluated in contrast to language documentation theory? Provenance of the collections are really important as well. And in my experience, they're not well articulated in the collections that I've personally used in my research. So life cycle and evaluation of enrichment of the content of a collection as an institution holds it in trust. And the capacity for reuse. How well is a particular language documentation suited for reuse? And how should we assess all of these things? Should we give it a 5-star system? Like, there's lots of ideas on assessment. So we are looking to see the exploration of assessment on these types of issues. And next slide, please. And so the second big area that we're looking at is would be the contextualized assessment, which takes social, technological, and linguistic factors into account. So how easy is it to and how easy is it to access the material and do stuff with it? And does that work just as well in a country that has good internet access as well as a country that doesn't have good internet access? Or maybe the technologies are different in the United States or Western Europe than in Africa or Papua New Guinea, or places where a lot of endangered languages exist and their communities primarily reside. The roles of individual reviewers. How should we explore assessment procedures for individual reviewers and authoritative bodies conducting assessment and promoting recognition and reuse of materials? Another vector or way of thinking about assessment is, how well suited for the needs of the community is the organization of the collection. And so looking at community access and reuse issues along with non-academic peers, which may be individuals or organizations doing things like speech to text with minority language materials from a commercial or enterprise kind of position. Internal assessment procedures used by language archives. So language archives might have scripts or internal review procedures for when a collection is submitted, that certain things must be in certain orders or described a certain way. And so that's certainly one way to explore assessment procedures for a collection. And sometimes those change from time to time, but there's really not a lot in the literature about that. So this is an open place to describe those kinds of things and to discuss the merits of those current practices. Assessment at multiple development stages of the documentary record. Richard talked about the documentary record taking years, and certainly in my case, we've had iterative processes both in Nigeria and Mexico. So adding to the collection over time and filling in missing genres or areas of the community types of activities that are conducted in that activity. How should that impact assessment? So that your longitudinal dynamic of assessment, how should that work out? As perhaps maybe more material in a collection becomes annotated or more material becomes transcribed. How should that affect the assessment of a collection in general? So those ideas we would like to see them explored in our context, in our collection. And finally, just let me go to the next slide for case studies. And case studies that we've seen a rise in both descriptions of collections being published in language documentation conservation, and I've noted a couple in other journals in the last, I'd say, 5 years. But I've also seen a couple of collection descriptions in educational journals, and I've seen a couple in archival journals that are even going back 20 years, 30 years, and are not directly related to language documentation, but they describe language resources in archival collections. but those are relatively rare. So we're looking to help raise the profile of these collections as well. And we can see that there's a couple of collection I just put some articles here, the guide to the Econ Language and Culture Documentation by Sophie Slaffner, and another one here. I can't read it because it's real small, but for me. But yes, there are a couple of these that are more frequently appearing, and I think a couple are soon to appear in the section of language. So in general, it's becoming a little bit more broader. So I think now Lauren might talk about the submission process.
Sure. Thanks, Hugh. So basically, we're looking for articles that are about 3,000 to 6,000 words in length, so not including references. And the deadline was July 1st, but it has been extended. So you can have a look at the submission guidelines, but I wanted to say a few words about the journal that is the home of this special collection. So if you could go to the next slide, please. The special collection is part of the Journal of Open Humanities Data. So you can find that journal at the URL here on the screen, and it's published by the open access publisher Ubiquity Press. This journal has been publishing since 2015, and it has articles about data and data practices and data sets from all kinds of different humanities disciplines. It includes art history, classics, literature, music, philosophy, and of course, linguistics. Next slide, please. So why this journal for this collection? Well, we felt it was really appropriate for a number of reasons. So first, the journal is open access, meaning that the content is free to read, share, and reuse. Open access journals increase the reach and impact of publications, and they lower or remove barriers to access to content. So the articles that are published in this special collection will be readable by anybody in the world and usable by them as well. We also like the policies of the journal around peer review, as well as giving credit for sharing data in the form of publishing data papers and having good citation practices. They really have a lot of guidance in this journal about how to do good data citation and how to get credit and how to talk about data work and data papers, which I think is a really great contribution to this discipline of people who do a ton of work with data in language documentation that isn't always recognized for the hard work and scholarly contribution that it is. So finally, as a librarian, I am always very interested in the preservation and storage and availability of information. So data sets that are discussed in the journal are stored in recommended repositories, and there's a lot of great guidance in the journal's help pages about how to use these repositories and which ones will be suitable for your content. And they have really excellent policies about the potential for reuse of information in this journal. And as Hugh and as Richard both said, the reuse of data is really one of the key things that we're thinking about here is how, why else would we make this information available in these language archives and do all of this work to clearly document and describe and assess and evaluate all of these language documentation data sets if they aren't able to be reused. So the idea of reuse of data is very important and something that we were particularly attracted to this journal for their policies on that. I will say this journal does have a publication fee. It is £450, which if you've ever looked at publication fees for some other journals, that is tiny compared to other public publishers. And we, as the editors and the journal staff, we are happy to help you look for funding sources and identify potential funding for this from your institution. But there's also waivers available if you don't have funding available. So please do not hesitate. If that is a barrier, just reach out to one of us. We can help you get that process started and make it as easy for you as possible. The fees are very clearly spelled out on the website. They have a list of all the things that the fees go to support, including our copy editing and the software and all these other things that are needed for journals. So your money is going to support the journal's production. So anyway, if you have any questions about that, please reach out to one of us editors. We're happy to help. I want to talk a little bit about the kinds of papers that appear in this journal. So please go to the next slide. This journal publishes two kinds of papers. Most of the papers for our collection will be these full-length research papers. These are intended to discuss and illustrate sort of methods or challenges or limitations, which some of the things that we're talking about here include all of these topics. And they are intended to be longer narratives and contribute to a broader discussion. And these are complemented by these other kinds of papers, which are short data papers. These contain a concise description of a research object or data set with high reuse potential. And these are really short, structured narratives, and there's a template for completing them. And these are very interesting contributions, and the ones I've read are really highlight the parts of data set or object that are really useful for people who might want to reuse them. So have a look at these types of papers. Most of the ones for the special collection, like I said, will be full-length papers, but you know, they have other possibilities if you have other projects in mind that might fit the journal. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the journal has been publishing since 2015, and it's been growing. And one way is through special collections like ours on a variety of topics. They have a bunch of special collections that you can peruse. And there's another really pertinent one, which is humanities data in the time of COVID-19, which is open. And we thought our collection would be a really good fit here because much of the work that has been done recently in linguistics on data citation, data management, open scholarship, and this journal was a place that some of these discussions could be developed further and be in conversation with these larger issues that are going on throughout all of the humanities. So on my final slide, I have the vision for the journal that I've pulled out of their aims and scope. The journal's aim is to really be a key part of the thriving community of scholars who are sharing humanities data. And we know that linguists have a habit of sharing data among our small communities, and this journal can help expand that sharing among more humanists to expand the possibilities of the kinds of data that linguists could use and to help share best practices and experiences for working with data across all of the humanities discipline. We think we can contribute a lot to the humanities data conversation and also learn a lot from our colleagues from other fields. And we hope that this journal will be a place where those conversations can start to happen. So I'm going to turn it over next to our next speaker, and we'll hear a little bit about a particular topic that's going to be discussed in the journal. So Christian, would you take it over from here?
So yeah, my name is Christian. I'm a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute of Evolutionary Anthropology, and I recently submitted an article we're talking about my experience as a depositor in language archives, and in a way, how we can assess that. So as Rachel and Hugh have been saying, the assessment of language archives has been proposed to be one of the ways out of the precarious situation in which very often we find ourselves because we cannot compete with people submitting fancy analytic papers in fancy journals. However, I argue in this paper that a lot of the assessment criteria that so far have been evaluators have been using has been a bit like playing by ear. And one of these things has to do with open access. So basically, the more open access material you have or unrestricted access material you have on your archive, the better grade you're gonna get, which is absolutely unfair for the depositor for various reasons that I try to explain here. And in the end, this ends up penalizing the depositor for being ethical. So basically, I argue that this problem comes from a faulty comparison or misunderstanding of open access in science, which is a good practice. So it's very wealthy journals hiding behind a paywall, tax-funded research, which isn't ethical, versus unrestricted access of language documentation, which is intimate text of everyday situations that are being exposed there, and yeah, they threaten the dignity and also the integrity very often of most vulnerable people groups, because most endangered language speakers are sociologically in a more vulnerable situation. Next slide, please. So I present a bit the conflicting interest or ideas that as an impositor we have to deal with. So on the one hand, we are being asked to provide the most naturalistic data as possible. So try your speakers to relax and to give you the best, their best, and like the less language interference as you can, and the most complete paradigms. But at the same time, we are being asked to be ethical. So when the people are relaxing and being natural, they unavoidably gonna start sharing some things that shouldn't be there. But at the same time, we are being asked to gather a corpus that is as diverse as possible in terms of genre, the sociological profile of speakers, and so on, which that itself entails a lot of problems. In communities, for example, when me as a cis male of a certain age cannot engage with women or working with underage and so on. And finally, we also asked to mind the community, which may have a very different agenda or interest from what we want and might not be happy with everything that they share being publicly accessible. Next slide, please. So basically, I propose some case studies where there are some of these challenging situations often less discussed in the literature, apart because a lot of the literature on ethics and fieldwork has to do with primarily North America or English-speaking countries. So I try to give a bit of a wider insight of all the situations that are less discussed in the literature. And I get to the conclusion that different situations require different approaches. That is to say, we cannot set an universal ethical standard for everyone. So unavoidably, in some cultures, people will be more open with displaying certain information and the community is less threatened. Whereas in other places, even within a few kilometers, for example, where I work in Dagestan, the differences are enormous. Like in some villages, unfortunately, religious fundamentalism is on the rise since the past 20 years. So what was possible 20 years ago to discuss nowadays is unthinkable to talk about music, dances, or other innocent topics, not even getting into more harsh political things. So that's why I argue that using open access as a criterion for equality is not fair. And I propose new criteria for assessing language archives in the light of all these problems. Yeah, that's basically what I wanted to share.
Great, thank you so much, Christian. I think that really exemplified some of the topics we've been discussing related to the ethical concerns that arise in trying to establish standards for assessment of documentary materials. So yeah, thank you very much for that.